Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Accelerate webinar series hosted by the University of Denver's Daniels College of Business Executive Education Department. I'm Camila Gilin, Assistant Director of Business Development, and I'll be your host today. The Accelerate webinar series is designed to help you accelerate your capacity to deliver results for your organization. Our webinar today will be about 25 minutes long, starting with a brief presentation from our faculty and then moving to questions and answers at the end. To help us see your questions, please use the Q&A icon at the bottom of your screen. Feel free to submit a question whenever you'd like, and we will address them at the end of this webinar. If we don't have time to address all of the questions during the webinar, we will record them after this live broadcast and then include them in an email follow-up to you. One other housekeeping item that I want to let you know is that this webinar has live closed captions and a live transcript. These are not 100% accurate, so to turn them on, use the CC icon at the bottom of your screen as well. Today, we are joined by Brandon Daruna. Brandon is the chief of the Gilpin Ambulance Authority and a 20-year EMS veteran. Currently, he serves in several boards, including the Foothills RETAC Board of Directors, the Gilpin County LEPC and Emergency Service Council, the North Central Region WASI Board of Directors, and the Rocky Mountain Combined SWAT Team. Brandon holds an executive MBA from the University of Denver and is a faculty member teaching in executive education. Brandon, our conversation today seems more relevant than ever. Not only we're still in the midst of a worldwide pandemic, here in Colorado, we just experienced a terrible mass shooting at the supermarket in Boulder, the second mass shooting in less than a week in the United States. So we cannot start this conversation without talking about these news and how they relate to leadership in emergency situations. I'll pass it over to you, and thank you again for joining us today.
Great, thanks, Camila, and thanks so much for having me. Thank you, everybody, for joining us today. I really appreciate you spending some time with us. And thanks for the University of Denver for inviting me. So you're absolutely right. We find ourselves today just a couple of days away from a real tragedy in Boulder, and certainly in the last few weeks, we've experienced more tragedy than I think anyone would like to do over the course of time. And it's important to sort of talk about that stuff, but I want to make clear, obviously this was planned before that happened, and certainly we don't want to be distracted too much by the structures of what are rare and really challenging. And I want to talk a little bit more today about what is applicable to you in your organizations and in your everyday life. So, just to touch on Boulder, sort of shook me, I think shook our whole community, certainly shook the response community, a really challenging day. And as I started thinking about it in the context of this conversation, I actually thought about something that Kyle Clark, so those of you that are in Denver probably know Kyle Clark, he's a 9 News anchor. And then when he was on the scene, really in the aftermath of the situation on Monday, he noted that it seemed so routine, that the response seemed to be normalized, that people weren't panicked, there was a calm. And he pointed out, we need to recognize that even though this has become routine for us, it is still tragic, it is still this rare and horrifying event. And so in that context, I'd like to talk a little bit about the differences between how emergency responders handle crisis situations and lead through crisis situations, and how maybe one in the general public working for a regular organization might contrast. And I think the first place is really cultural. So emergency response and emergency responders have developed a culture that really turns crisis into something that is more routine. And this is strategic. Clearly, in order to be able to be in high performance situation in these environments that are really demanding and have a tremendous emotional toll, we have to be able to separate ourselves from that sort of emotional context. And we can sort of learn a lot of lessons in our organizations and in the private side from the strategy that is used there, but really to compare what happened on Monday to the last 20 years. And I think what Kyle was after was 20 years ago when we saw a similar event in our community, the response was one that was very challenged. It was unexpected. I think emergency response, really hadn't considered being in that sort of environment. And so it was a difficult day for everyone involved, and certainly moving forward for a long time. But the actual physical response was very less than ideal in the sense that it wasn't efficient inside of the way we would hope that it would be. Flash forward 20 years, and Kyle points out all of a sudden there's this calm, routine, sort of almost machine way of dealing with this thing that I think most of us would consider to be a really horrible and difficult and clearly a rare event. And it's important, I think, the lesson to learn: how did emergency services get there? What did we do to make this so routine? Because by making it routine and removing the emotion from our ability to respond, we significantly increase our capability in that horrible situation. Now, it's important to point out, I think, that I'm not suggesting that these aren't very impactful situations for those particular responders. And certainly over the course of the time that's subsequent to their response, they're significantly affected. But in the moment, when they're actually there executing the response, there is a routine nature, and it is foundational in the culture of the way we do business. So there's a few things that I want to touch on as far as how we got there. And the first one is language. So you'll notice when you start to think about crisis, there are lots of sort of words and phrases that are used on the organizational side that we use to sort of denote the fact that we're in a crisis. And the one that I love the most is people say things like, we're in crisis mode. So all of a sudden, our organization, there's something going on, we're pivoting and we're moving into crisis mode. And we're going to put this fire out, and we're going to stop the bleeding, and we're going to do all these things that are going to meaningfully impact this problem. That is, I think, something that all of us have experienced when there are unexpected events that occur in our organizations. Now, if we contrast that with emergency services, we call these sort of situations incidents. And we don't talk about putting fires out or stopping bleeding unless we're actually putting fires out or stopping bleeding. And the way we talk to each other about managing these sort of incidents is very much removing us from the emergency. In fact, there are phrases in our industry, one of which is, it's not your emergency. So often when we have new folks that are engaged in our organizations and they're in the learning process, we will say to them, this isn't your emergency. Not to downplay the critical nature of the problem or the impact to the individuals that are involved, but just this is an aspect of being successful, which is removing yourself, especially emotionally, from being sort of affected by whatever this particular problem is. So as we move forward with language, we say, we position ourselves in a way that we can have that distance, and that distance is what allows us to then make objective decisions. So, really in preparation for managing emergencies, we have developed a culture that distances ourselves from the emotional impact. Now, there certainly are downsides to that long term, and we don't have the time today really to discuss that. But the important part that I want you to recognize is that there is an advantage to that separation. And so as we start to characterize problems in our organizations, we need to recognize how we are transmitting our belief about how we're going to manage those problems. And as you say things like crisis mode, you're moving organization out of its typical structure of response and problem solving. And you're moving beyond this sort of rational structure of problem solving into a more intuitive, more reactionary, more emotional structure. There's a great book called Thinking Fast and Slow, written by Kahneman, that sort of leads us to understand how this movement in sort of decision making can be ill-effective when we're trying to manage emergencies. And so basically what Kahneman says is there are two systems of problem solving, and I'll give you a very brief description. So system one is this intuitive, emotional, reactionary structure. It's the kind of structure that we would impart if we were sort of emotionally affected by something and we had sort of an outburst or a communication that wasn't something that we were kind of filtering. But it is that initial instinct that you have when you want to solve a problem. System two is slower, it's deliberative, it's more logical, and certainly it is the system that we would want to employ anytime we wanted to solve problems. The issue that arises when we are in this sort of crisis structure is that our instinct immediately is to sort of quote unquote, put the fire out. And we respond in system one. So we immediately start making emotional decisions, and we use intuition to sort of make, to structure our decision-making process. The problem with intuition is we good at making good decisions when we lack information and when we use the context of our sort of previous lives and experiences to try to structure a response. And so we will see this all the time. Anybody that has worked someplace or has been in a situation where there was sort of a Chicken Little sort of person that had a really emotional, very, very animated response to a particular problem, recognizes right away that once we get distance from that problem, the sort of response that may have occurred isn't necessarily ideal. And so how, as organizations, do we move and structure our systems of problem solving to be able to stay in that system 2 deliberative and logical structure? I would make a few suggestions. So first and foremost, I think we need to look at problem growth. So we need to look at the sort of nature in which the problem is growing. And I would suggest that most of the time, many of us are experiencing these sorts of crises, but really, if we dug down and tried to understand the sort of impact and speed of impact, we would recognize that they are either not moving or they're moving very slowly. And so if we immediately remove that emotional component and we start to slow down and think specifically about what's happening, we can sort of back away and recognize that there's not a cost or not a significant cost to a slow, structured response. The key to having that ability is to have expertise in the particular area that you're trying to address. So the way that one can prepare an organization to be able to slow down and to be able to have a more logical, analytical approach is to really, truly understand the potential problems that we face. One of the, I think, excellent books that's been written in the last 10 years is something called Gray Rhino by Wucher. It's this sort of understanding that imagine yourself at a campfire in the Serengeti, and there's a rhino closing on you, and you're mesmerized by the rhino continuing to march towards you. And you know that this is a problem, but you are sort of tricked into thinking that there's not a necessary response until the rhino is right there on top of you. And so we have to start getting better at recognizing the problems that are closing on us that will become the next crisis, and then position our organizations to be able to respond to them in an expert way. If we do those two things, then when we are confronted with the rhino that's closing, or even the thing that we didn't see coming, and recognize that we need to have this more structured, more logical approach, we can then think slow, and we can recognize that we need to bring in expertise. We need to develop logical and structured problem solving to be able to handle these issues. Now, that is if the problem growth is slow, if we anticipate things coming, and we can sort of build these models of problem solving to address them. On the other side, occasionally we're going to come across exponential growth in problem solving. We're going to see things that are wildly out of control, and they are expanding by the minute. And obviously this is the stop the bleeding, this is the put the fire out, and that language can be very, very appropriate in telegraphing to ourselves and to the people around us that these problems are problems that need to be immediately solved. That is when we'll move into a more intuitive way of structuring our response. And if we are in that sort of structure of response and in that problem solving mode, we have to recognize that the more preparation we have in understanding the potential problem, the better our intuition will be. So the better we'll be able to look at this scenario, develop a plan in a very sort of short, speedy, emotional way, but that plan will be worthwhile. And in emergency response, it's exactly the same. So we very rarely are we in situations that are exponentially growing, but when we are, and we certainly, face our fair share of those sorts of problems, we have very set forth, structured ways of addressing them. But immediately upon recognizing that the exponential growth has stopped, we stop, we change gears, we move to a more logical and analytical problem-solving structure, and we move forward in trying to solve the problem. And to sort of circle back to the original example in Boulder, there was a horrible exponentially growing problem. The initial response was one that was without sort of delay in problem solving or logic. The first people that got there went right in and tried to sort of manage the problem. Once the officers that were responding recognized that the problem was no longer growing, right? They said themselves, we don't hear the shooting anymore. And then they stopped, they had a thoughtful pause, they built an analytical structure to try to respond, and then went in a way that was with a different tactic. And that is a perfect example of how one would transition from an understanding of exponential growth into this slow or no growth sort of problem solving strategy, and then move from a system one way of addressing the problem, instinctive and emotional, to the system two deliberative and more logical structure. So I think that sort of in a nutshell is the way that we in our organizations, in our sort of discussions as we structure organizations to be more capable, can build a model of understanding of how we will be able to prepare for the next challenge. I think that, you know, going back to the beginning, the language that we use to communicate these sorts of problems is so important, because it both establishes the foundation for our own way of approaching the problem, whether it's something that is manageable within a logical structure or it's something that is really panic and out of control, but it also telegraphs that to the rest of the people that are around us. So if we are that centered, calm voice that recognizes that we need to build an analytical structure, bring in experts and understand the problem as we address it, people around us are going to reflect that. If we are the person that sees the problem and immediately starts to have sort of an overwhelming emotional response, we are going to see that come back to us reflected from the people that are around us, and that will move the strategy of the problem solving pretty immediately. To close, I want to say there is you know, a lot of discussion and some interesting, you know, in the last 15 years, discussion about whether or not we can actually prepare for problems, whether or not we really understand the landscape that we're in and the next thing that's really going to change that landscape. And you know, if you've heard of black swan theory and Taleb's sort of understanding of the way that things have changed the world, I think that it's very applicable. If you're interested in this sort of stuff and you want to sort of see a thought structure that isn't often included in crisis management, but I think should be, the Black Swan Theory book is very good. And basically, in a nutshell, what he discusses is this idea that we both can't prepare for or predict what the next real pivotal life-changing sort of event is going to be. And then the interesting thing is, after it's happened, our hindsight tells us that we can. And so that sort of juxtaposition of not really being able to predict, but then later on feeling as though you can, tricks us into thinking that we have this ability to really position ourselves to be ready for the next thing. It's an excellent sort of structure to think about crisis, but it's important to recognize that it doesn't apply to everything. So our everyday crises, I don't think apply, but certainly when we're building structures that are going to be able to manage sort of large scale changes in our society, like 9/11, for example, you know, it is something that we need to build structures that are capable of responding to a whole myriad of things, but not any particular sort of prediction, because the likelihood is whatever our prediction is going to be wildly different from what actually happens. So, you know, I appreciate everybody taking the time to listen to me talk about this. I think it's an expansive topic, and certainly, you know, we could spend days and days. There's tens and tens of books that are written about it. But this is sort of the way I think about it in a nutshell. And I think that language is very, very important. I think that recognizing the sort of linear nature of growth is really important, and then making good decisions to try to move from that decision-making structure that is system one into that system two logical analytical decision-making structure. So thanks.
Thank you, Brent. On that topic, so you just talked about the first thing is changing language, right? And that's tied to the first question that we have here from an anonymous attendee, and it says, great presentation. Besides not using the word crisis, what other tips do you have about language in more regular organizations?
Yeah, I think that so we have to recognize how all the language we use to describe any sort of problem biases our own thinking about the problem, and then also biases other people's thinking. So immediately when we're using words like crisis or you know, I think the things I said before, stopping the bleeding, all these sort of examples that are really graphic and you know, they describe exponentially growing life-threatening problems. And you know, I think that it's rare that we're interacting with those sort of problems in a day-to-day sort of workplace environment. And so if that's not the case, then we should use you know, more logical, more sort of truth-based or fact-based structures to describe this stuff, because we then, with a calm and well thought out way of describing the problem, will transmit to everyone that this is something that's solvable and not something that needs to sort of be surrounded with panic.
Perfect. I have more questions, but we're also getting questions from more attendees, which is great. And the next one says, in light of the black swan notion, what advice do you have for organizational leaders in preparing for possibilities that they aren't thinking about? How do you prepare for what you don't know?
So what Taylor would say is this concept of antifragility, and it's in depth, but I can say very, very simply, antifragility is the idea that negative inputs, so the problems that you will face, will actually improve your organization. And the best example of that is your immune system. So when your immune system experiences something, that experience then makes it better in the future. As it moves through learning about the world or learning about the bugs that might hurt you in the world, it is building more resilient ability to take care of you. And so that anti-fragile concept can be applied to organizations, and certainly there's all kinds of different ways to do that, but any sort of structure that shares mistakes so that all sort of members of an organization can benefit from one member's mistake is a way of making an organization anti-fragile. So essentially that negative, that sort of problem that occurred then can be broadcast to everyone, and one mistake can be beneficial to all, and the organization becomes stronger moving forward.
Awesome. Michael asks, what tools can we use to recognize to help our teams move from system 1, intuitive thinking, towards system 2, logical thinking?
Well, I think you need to determine who, you need to develop expertise. So, the way emergency services does this is really honing in on the potential problems that we will face, and then building robust structures of training. And so really giving people the opportunity to both understand the problem and experience solving the problem over and over and over again until the problem solving structure actually moves into the intuitive space, right? So it becomes part of the way I respond to something. I fall back to this sort of level of my training. And so when we move that into the sort of private structures of organizations, I think it becomes, truly understanding the business you're in, being an expert in the business you're in, really understanding the potential pitfalls that you may face and developing expertise. And then also when you're in the moment of response, sourcing those people that are experts. So, those are the people that should drive the problem solving structure that is applied to the problem. And that will move you, anybody that is an expert in a particular area will sort of have an intuitive ability to be in system 2, which seems, counterintuitive. But they will have that instinct that is sort of firmly footed in logic.
Yeah. So it seems like there's a way to bring both together, to bring your intuition with an ability to look at the situation logically and use them as one to approach problems. Or am I completely wrong?
No, I think you're right. So if, developing that sort of expert ability to be able to manage whatever that particular situation is, and certainly it's very different depending on the type of business that you're in or the certain situation you may face. But as you gain expertise in an area, the sort of anxiety related to solving a problem with sort of recedes, because you feel a lot more able to be have a mastery and understanding of the potential outcomes.
Awesome. We do have one more question that asks, do you have any tips for building resilience? That's a tough one.
Yeah. I think that in order to be sort of resilient in dealing with situations that first responders deal with, we as an industry are not very good at it yet. I think we're trying to get better, but being really sort of capable as you're moving into the problem personally. So, physical health and emotional health, and making sure that you feel as though you have an anchor in relationships and all those sorts of things. Those can be really protective against some of the harm. But certainly, anytime you're dealing with, especially when you're dealing with these life and death sorts of situations, there's going to be a toll. We have to recognize that going in, and then we have to have real support structures for those folks coming out. So if your organization is facing something that is truly, really challenging, anticipate from the very beginning that there's going to be aftermath and that has to be addressed.
Perfect. We did get another question from Eric Medina, and it says, language also changes for each group in this incident. Patrol officers talk and understand different than upper brass. It is hard to get each group to understand each other. How do we get each group to understand each other?
That's an interesting question. I think that we teach a program called Public Safety Leadership Development that specifically addresses that issue. So, really what we're trying to do is build common methods of communication so that people from different walks of life can understand each other. But all this sort of stuff, all this, ability to function in these situations has to happen. The training and the structures have to be built, far in advance. So if you've got multiple agencies, multiple levels of training, multiple rank structures, different partner agencies, EMS and fire, all working together, in order for that kind of stuff to go smoothly, it has to be well planned and rehearsed in advance. And so all those sort of methods of communication have to be well established before you're actually in that, heat of the moment situation.
Yeah, you don't want to wait for that to happen to actually experiment with it.
Right, and that's, a lot of the issues we've had on that side of things historically have been because people speak different languages, and that could be anything from, in our world, it is the use of the radio or particular sort of words that are used or ways of describing things, but it could also be cultural, it could be, from geographic location, it could be socioeconomic, all kinds of different things that affect people's inabilities to communicate.
Got it. Well, Brendan, thank you so much for being with us today. We really appreciate all the content, all the heart that you put into this, and just being an exec ed faculty as well. That means a lot to us. And to our participants, thank you for taking the time to join us. If you like this webinar, you have to learn more about the Public Safety Leadership Development Program that Brendan was talking about. He teaches there, and it's coming up this fall. Just go on the Executive Education page and search for our workshops. We will be back on Thursday, April 22nd with Joe Hernandez to talk about what everyone needs to know about negotiation. You can't miss that one. Once again, thank you for joining us today. We hope you gain new insight that will accelerate your impact in your community, your organization, and the world. From the University of Denver Daniels College of Business Executive Education Department, we look forward to seeing you again on the Accelerate webinar series. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.